Hey guys, I just wanted to do a quick example where we can go calculating percents. We're going to look at things where we can actually use our calculator this time, and it allows us a little bit more functionality. I'm going to show, there's lots of different ways to calculate percent. So I'm going to give you a couple of different ways. You can pick the one that seems to make the most sense to you. I know in grade 7 you would have been talking about fractions in terms, percents in terms of changing the percent to a decimal and going through a multiplication technique. So I'll show that one first. So the example would be I'll do an easy one like 65% of 120. And if you're looking at finding 65% of 120, the easiest way, or probably the most connected way that you would have had already, would be to simply take your percent, divide it by 100, and then take that answer, which is 0.65. So now it's no longer a ratio out of 100, it's a ratio over 1. And take that and simply multiply it by 120. And once you've turned the fraction, or the percent, sorry, I keep saying fraction. Once you've turned the percent into the decimal, it's taking it down to essentially the denominator, instead of it being out of 100, is down to a 1. And we can do a simple multiplication at that point. Okay, so I would go 0.65 and I'd multiply that by 120. And you get 78, right? So it equals 78. So now I know 65% of 120 is 78. That's my answer. Now, one thing I kind of want to tie into, or just make sure that you guys understand, that's one way. I'm going to show you a different way. I'm going to use a different color. We'll use like a blue. I could also look at it, and some people will do this, is they'll go 65 times 120 divided by 100. Doesn't make a difference in this case. The other way that I'm thinking about doing it is actually recognizing that the words of 120 mean that 100% of my thing is 120. I have 120 things. That's 100%. That's all of it. If I have 65%, what I want to do is I want to set up a ratio. And I can compare 65% and 100%. And I can say in this ratio, I can say, well, I know that 100% is 120. So I would put 120 on the bottom because I want it across from the 100%. The 65, I don't know what it is. That's what I'm looking for. So I'm going to call it an n. And then I can use a technique called cross multiplying. And basically what I'm doing is I'm comparing ratios. And I'm trying to make equivalent ratios and find out what n would be. To do this cross multiplying, essentially, I'm just going to do this. So I'm going to quickly draw an arrow, and I'm going to take the 65 and I'm going to multiply it by the 120. And I'm going to take my n and I'm going to multiply it by 100. So that's for the cross multiplying, right? Top on one side, bottom on the other. So I end up getting a scenario where, and I'm going to keep the n on the left side, I get 100 times n, and on the other side I get 65 times 120. Now to get n by itself, you would simply just divide by 100, divide this side by 100, and that leaves your n term by itself, and you have n is 65 times 120 divided by 100. So putting that in my calculator, I get 65 times 120, take that answer, 7,800, and divide it by 100, and I end up getting my same answer. N equals 78. So key thing I want you guys to understand is it doesn't matter which way I do this. Yes, for this circumstance, I would argue this is probably my easier technique. But when they start to get more complicated, and when we start to move on to our next calculating like percents is scenario, I call these calculating percent of something. When we start moving into the calculating percent is, this technique actually starts to become a little bit easier. So it's up to you which one we go with. Both obviously are kind of doing the same thing essentially. This one's dividing it by 100 first to get it to a decimal, 65 divided by 100, and then you're multiplying by 120. So you're getting the same answer, you're kind of going through either way. And I'm going to say pick the method that works best for you. This works no matter what your percentage is. So I can get scenarios where I could say find 0.32% of 1,000, let's say 12,985, and it might be a decimal, right? But if I have that scenario where find 0.32% of this big number, same logic, right? I can start, take my percent. First thing I have to do is divide it by 100. So 0.32 divided by 100. And I just moved the decimal. Once I have that, I'm going to take that decimal and I'm going to times it by my 12,985. When I take my calculator out and I do this, 0.0032, I times that by 12,985, and I get 41.552. Right? We can do this rounding. You normally would round to the nearest whole number if we're actually looking at things. So I could say, which is approximately equal to, I ran out of room. Approximately equal to 42. Okay, so that's one way to do it. Same logic, I could take this exact same question and I could approach it using my ratios. Same logic, 0.32%, comparing it with 100%. On the other side, I know I'm trying to figure out what the 0.32% is, but I know that this is 12,985 is that one. And again, I'm just going to look at this as my cross multiplying, and I'm simply going to get a scenario of 100 times n is equal to 0.32 times 12,985. To get n by itself, I'll do it in blue here so you guys can see. I'm going to divide by 100 and divide this side by 100. And that leaves me with n is equal to 0.32 times 12,985 divided by 100, which will be 41.552 or 42. So I hope that makes sense. Again, it does not matter the technique you use, whether you use the basic, turn the percent into a decimal and multiply, or you use the ratios. Okay, again, as we move forward, the ratios will probably become a little bit easier, especially since we're going to be looking at ratios as our next topic after percents. Hope it makes sense, guys. I'll give you a couple questions and we can practice it and see how things go. Thanks.